Right, hi everyone. It is the Paper 3 preview. So this is the last one of the 2025 exam series. This is all about the live music industry. So Paper 3, a little bit different to Papers 1 and 2 because we know we've got that case study. I'm going to do a bit of Paper 3 stuff and then a bit of context, like a bit of live music stuff. So let's talk through what we're gonna cover. Right, so first things first, it is the same in the sense that it's one section per hour. But we don't have 4 markers on this paper. We've got an 8 marker instead. So each section is 8, 10, 12, 20, which means every single question is an essay. This means timing's much, much tighter on paper 3. Read the questions and take the case study. Make life easier for yourself later on. Timing wise, I mean, this is kind of pie in the sky really. If you use your first 10 minutes, probably less than 10 minutes to go through the case study, then you want 8 minutes for the 8 marker, 10 minutes for the 10 marker. 12 minutes for the 12 marker, and then obviously 20 minutes at the end of that first half for the 20 marker, and then 20 minutes at the end of the second half for the second 20 marker. You probably, in reality, want to spend a bit less time on the case study, knowing that your 8, 10, and 12, they're all 2 paragraphs. And so the key thing is you've got to be really, really quick with your 8 marker. And timing is the trickiest bit here, which is why watching the clock and making sure you use the case study effectively and annotate the case study effectively to make answering the questions quicker is really, really important. So let's talk about paper 3 essay structures. 8 markers, optional definition, and then 2 peach paragraphs. Timing, as I've already mentioned, this is where people trip up. Get your timing right. It is tricky to do an 8 marker in the place of 2. It's just much quicker to do 2 4 markers. So you've got to make sure you do your 8 marker really, really quick. If that means you sacrifice a little bit of depth and quality, like in terms of your analysis, and you don't quite write as much in your paragraphs, especially your howevers need to be really short. You don't need a conclusion. That's also really, really important. On papers 1 and 2, every essay has a conclusion. On paper 3, your 8 markers don't need a conclusion. It's just an SS2 question. So you just have paragraph 1, paragraph 2. Then the rest is the same as papers 1 and 2. So this is stuff you'll be familiar with from obviously doing the first 2 papers. 10 and 12 markers, peach, and then AGM. So obviously our paragraph with our however gives us our balance and then our conclusion. Use the words of the question in your first sentence, and obviously don't forget you do need a conclusion here. And then obviously for our 20 marker, we've got our 2 options, peach for option 1, peach for option 2. That includes your however, which obviously is your negative, and then your conclusion. Read the question carefully. Is there a particular focus? Make sure you link to this in your question. You've seen these already, obviously, and then again, make sure you've got balance. Your however for option 1 shouldn't just be the benefit of option 2. You need to consider negatives as well. So those are the kind of main structures we need for these types of questions. We've obviously talked about conclusions in the other videos as well, but it's worth just going through again. Make your answer clear. Use the words of the question. Justify your main reason for the decision. Is there a potential factor that it depends on? And what is the most important point? The MOP stuff, it's a bit different for this one because we know what the market is. We know it's the live music industry or the music industry in general. And so, it's not like some of this is going to come from the video that we get in here, and obviously you have a bit of familiarity going into it, providing you've done a little bit of research. So keys to success, as always, get your timing right, use the application in the case study, get your structures right. We've obviously gone through all of these things, and then lastly, just have your knowledge. Remember, if you make a mistake on any of the questions, it's probably going to be because of one of these 4 areas. In terms of exam content, what could come up? Well, everything. This is the paper that covers all 4 themes. And I've had a question a few times in comments over the last few days and weeks asking if stuff that's come up in papers 1 and 2 could come up again in paper 3. Yeah, it definitely could. I wouldn't necessarily, it's likely to, but it can. It has happened in the past. And so, but by this point, you should have revised everything really. And hopefully that gives you enough of a kind of foundational knowledge that you're just going through and, practicing some calculations and checking some key terms and things like that. The main things to be focused on in terms of your revision content-wise is probably some of the things that I'm mentioning during this video. Calculations in paper 3. We've established there's no 4 marker, so calculations will be required. It's about 10%. It's at least 10% of the marks are going to come from some level of quantitative skill. So what you typically have is you have a calculation or interpreting a data or interpreting a table or something like that, or reading a graph. That'll be required as part of an essay question. So I've gone back through all the different papers, and these are the ones that have come up. There are other examples of questions that have used a little bit of data, but these are kind of the most obvious ones in terms of like really interpreting data. So you've got a takeover with accountancy calculations, so basically ratio analysis. We've had investment appraisal came up in 2018. We had a moving averages in 2019. Supply and demand diagram, and as part of a written 8 marker. We've had a whole bunch of different things. Investment appraisal, obviously, again in 2022, and then liquidity kind of ratio analysis in 2024. The key thing here with these is that it does mean that this gives you your application, basically, using the data you've identified is your application. And in some respects, it makes your application easier, but it does make it take longer. And so there's a fair expectation that you're probably not going to be able to write quite as much for those questions as you might for others, just because of the fact that they're also expecting you to do some calculations as you go through. So in terms of these calculations, what to look for, paper 3 is probably going to show you more data than the previous papers will have. Sometimes it's just tables of data. Sometimes they require specific calculations. It's also usually clearer in saying using extract B or using extract F to direct you to the right case study. Sometimes it might tell you which ones you actually need to do. So for example, investment appraisal, they'll usually tell you 2 of the 3. So maybe it'll say payback period and average rate of return, or payback period and net present value. If it says accountancy ratios for ratio analysis, the idea is you're going to have to try and work out which ones are worth calculating, which ones are going to tell you something useful. But really important to kind of make sure you're aware of that when it looks at essay questions. This is all your application. But you can't just do the calculation and say, right, well, the gross profit margin is 60%. You will need to kind of have an understanding of whether that's good or bad and the things that kind of go along with that as well. So pre-release bullet points. This is kind of the main part of this video, really. This is what you need to know about the pre-release before we go any further. You don't need to have done any research. You will get case studies like any other A-level business paper. Doing some research does help though, because it does give you an understanding of the market. You might even see a case study that you've already have some knowledge on. I mean, hopefully some of the bits that I mentioned in this video will be kind of themes that come up. But the key thing here is that you don't need to have actually done your research. You're going to get case studies. If you turned up having done no research at all, you could still get an A-star if you are really great at using the case study. I just think it's helpful to have a bit of an idea about what to expect going in. So what I've done is I've looked at these pre-release bullet points and I've tried to identify particular kind of themes and topics that I think maybe are potentially likely to come up. Again, I've got obviously no insider knowledge on this, but looking at it, you can kind of it gives you a few little hints. And then I've also tried to put together a bit of a background on some of the parts of the industry as well, just so that it gives you a bit of an idea about what the music industry, recording, distribution, and live performance industries are like. Give you a bit of a mention of some of the businesses, just in case they come up as case studies, just to give you a bit of a head start, really. So that's what I'm going to kind of do. I've got a kind of few thank yous to say before we get into this, really. And that is, I asked my Year 13 students earlier this year to deliver presentations based on particular like research prompts that I'd given them, based around these bullet points. And they did incredible amounts of research, and I've used a lot of the research that they've done and added to it to form part of this. So I want to say thank you to them. The PowerPoint theme that the rest of the PowerPoint goes into is a kind of musical based one that I stole from a few of my students, Lola, Georgia, and Lexi. They stole it from online and then adapted it, but it was a really, really impressive kind of like presentation. It looked quite cool and musicy, so I just have stolen that. So the other person I want to thank is I've got a friend called Grant, one of my high school friends, who's a journalist and music writer. So he writes, he's written for hip hop magazines in the past. He's also been an agent, so he's kind of got of a musician, a rapper called. He's also been an agent of a musician, and so he's kind of got a lot of experience in some of these areas. So he's kind of given me a few bits of advice over this, and he's given me a few prompts for things that are worth looking at. So thanks to all of them, I've been able to put this research together. This is kind of the main part of the presentation, really. So let's get stuck into the music recording, distribution, and live performance industries. So we're going to start with current trends in the consumption of recorded music. I think this is quite straightforward, but then I was thinking about this, and I've lived through a lot of these, and I'm obviously old, so you probably haven't as an 18-year-old about to do this exam. So hopefully there'll be some bits in here that you'll learn. So in terms of current trends in the consumption of recorded music, we kind of go all the way back to the 1900s, really, when we saw the beginning of the vinyl. So a vinyl or a record, as your grandparents maybe would refer to it, that was kind of the first way we had recorded music being played in people's houses or in, clubs and things like that. So vinyl was then followed by radios. So that obviously allowed people to listen to music on the go. Obviously now, most often you'll see a radio in a car, although to be honest, you probably never use the radio in your car either. Some people still listen to radios in the house. Obviously, there's loads of radio stations all over the UK and all over the world. That was followed by cassettes. So that little contraption there is a cassette, and so it was a tape recording. And so what you would do basically is you would wind it back, and you'd be able to record onto the cassette, and then you'd play it on a cassette player, and then when you were finished, you could either turn it around, turn it over, and play the other side, the B side, which is where the term B side comes from. Well, actually, B side. You might not even know what a B side is. It came from vinyls and cassettes, really. So typically, when you release some music on a vinyl, you'd have the A side and the B side because they only had a limited amount of storage space, and so you would turn it over and listen to the other side, or with the cassette you turn it around and listen to the other side. Quite often, if someone's releasing a single, again, now it's just kind of like a digital download, which we'll touch on in a second, but you used to be able to get you'd buy a single, and then there'd be a B-side on there, basically as a secondary track, so maybe something that wasn't on the album. So for a lot of your favorite artists, there'll be a ton of B-sides out there that you can potentially listen to. So cassettes came around in the kind of 1970s. Then we had CDs in the 1990s. And CDs were absolutely massive. There was a huge explosion of growth in music when CDs became popularized. They had bigger storage. You could fit kind of 15 tracks on them, whereas you might not have been able to do that, obviously, on a vinyl or a cassette. And after CDs, we moved into kind of the more digital world. So this was MP3s. So you would download the music file. MP3 was the format of the file. And then you'd have them on your iPod or your phone or something like that. And that's how you'd listen to music. So instead of having to carry around a whole bunch of CDs, you could just carry one little MP3 player. Obviously, now in the 2010s and present day, we still have access to a lot of the other things, but it's really streaming is where we kind of listen to our music. When I first got a car, I think I first started driving. I passed my test about 2009, 2008, and started driving after I finished university. And I used to have a big pack of CDs in my car, and before I would start on a drive, I would figure out which ones I wanted to listen to, and I'd lay them out on the passenger seat, and then when I finished the CD, I'd put the next one in. Fast forward to 2025, my car has Spotify, so you can just I can press a button on my steering wheel and say play Sam Fender or play the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and it'll just play it. So technology's advanced quite a lot. You can see obviously the massive growth in the 90s. I was born in 1989, so 90s to 2000s, 2010s is my lifetime basically. You can see how quickly the transitions are there compared to in previous times, just because of the giant boom in technology. So if we think about that, that's definitely an area worth focusing on. To further kind of demonstrate this is units sold in millions over the years. This is looking at the past several decades. So you can see that obviously vinyl and radio and tape and even CDs kind of all diminished over the last sort of 20 years as MP3s and streaming has really, really kicked on. There's a few kind of little interesting bits in here that I think are worth paying attention to. Is obviously radio can still be really, really popular because there are so many radio stations out there. Tape, very few kind of tape recordings. But vinyl is quite interesting that it's actually growing. You obviously see streaming's growth has been absolutely huge for music, but the vinyl growth in recent years has actually been quite interesting in the sense that people are starting to view vinyls as more kind of like collectibles. Which I think is providing a different type of music consumption to just kind of people listening to on streaming and Spotify. When I was a teenager, if I wanted to have a song or have an album, I had to buy the album to get it. Now you pay a subscription, and so you might pay if you like music as much as I did, you might be spending 20, 30, 40 quid a month on CDs, depending on what was kind of coming out at that time. And now you pretty much just have a subscription of Spotify for 15 quid, and you can listen to pretty much anything you want. Not obviously just Spotify, but there's loads of others as well, but gives you an example. What's really interesting is that the vinyls have actually become quite expensive. They're almost like collector's items, but they have had a massive increase in popularity, and we'll touch on that a little bit more later on. So in terms of topics, what can we link this to? First of all, it's a hugely dynamic market. So you think about 1.1, just the concept of a dynamic market. What causes it to be a dynamic market is technology, really. So if we think about 3.1.4 external influences, we think about pestle factors. In particular, technological innovation is the biggest one. One really interesting feature is that each era is largely made obsolete by the next. So you kind of have like almost like a product life cycle of each of these different types of music. And what obviously I mentioned is that vinyl example as an example of how trends can be fed by nostalgia, and how actually their product life cycle was obviously very, very firmly in decline for a long period of time, but has had a bit of a resurgence, a kind of almost like a second life cycle because of the nostalgia and because of the collectibles. And I think actually in some respects, when things become so digital, sometimes people want something physical, sometimes people want something they can like have in their house or display on a wall or something like that. So it is interesting to note that the vinyl side of things in particular has finished its product life cycle, but then had a little bit of a mini rebirth as well. So I think that's kind of enough in terms of current trends in the consumption of recorded music. For this next one, we're going to have a look at different businesses in the UK market, music retail market. They're specifically talking about retail here, independents and multinationals. Now, I'm not going to go through like big case studies of loads of different businesses because, to be honest, it could be any. I mean, especially when you think about independents. And you'll get this in a case study. But here are some kind of general themes that are worth having a look at. First topic worth looking at is forms of business, right? Sole trader, partnership, private limited company, public limited company. And I think we can split these probably reasonably well between independents and multinationals. Our independents are much more likely to be sole traders and partnerships or private limited companies that are privately owned, whereas the multinationals are probably going to be PLCs with maybe some LTDs where the owners want to maintain control. So we think about like a business like HMV as an example of a multinational business. We think about like any kind of like vinyl record store as a independent. So if you think about like your local town, if I think about Ipswich, then we've got kind of like I don't know if there's a HMV in Ipswich, but there's certainly one in Newcastle. But there's lots of other little kind of like little mini record stores which are usually run by like a one person. I don't know if there's any significant kind of record store chains. Obviously HMV do records, but in terms of like the classic old independent in the city centre stores, I just think it's worth looking into that because that's a really obvious potential area for a topic, for a question about the difference between these or focusing on independents and multinationals and maybe the difference between the two. It's mentioned, so obviously it's mentioned for a reason. So I wouldn't shock me to see anything on forms of business. Potentially sole trader partnership, private limited company, public limited company. So thinking about the benefit of these, thinking about kind of control, thinking about risk and reward and all of those things. I'm not going to go through that in much more depth really because, as I said, to be honest, you're going to get case studies. If there's a particular business in there, you'll get a case study. But that's the kind of the difference in terms of independents and multinationals. We are going to come back to this very briefly when we look at objectives in a second. So business growth and objectives in the music retail distribution sector. First things first, the topic objectives, we've just got to think about the different objectives that they might have here. In theory, our independents are probably much more focused on survival, while multinationals are going to be more focused on profit growth and share price, obviously share price if they're a PLC. But it is worth just noting that like HMV, for example, has failed several times. So if we think about business failure and the causes of these business failures, HMV has called it, this is a kind of a screenshot of a news article from 2018, but HMV called in administrators for the second time in 6 years. I think they're owned by JD Sports now, but it just goes to show that these big businesses aren't immune from failure either, and survival was an objective of HMV for quite a long time. They suffered because of all the technological innovation, right? If you think about HMV, they predominantly in the 2000s and 2010s did their business from selling CDs and selling DVDs. Well, the streaming services kind of killed that off to a degree. You've got Netflix taken away and Disney Plus, etc., taking away the need to buy DVDs. And you've got Spotify and Apple Music and all of these taking away the need to buy physical music. So HMV now, I mean, if you had a time machine and went back, to be fair, if you had a time machine, you probably wouldn't need to be doing your A-levels because you'd be a bazillionaire from having a time machine. But if you did have a time machine, you went back to like a HMV from 2005 when I was sort of 16, you would have just found more than half of the store would have been DVDs and CDs. And now you've got like a vinyl section and the rest of it's just kind of merchandise for like pop culture stuff that you can't kind of download. You can't download a t-shirt or a mug or like a or something like that. So it's just interesting to think about how the different types of businesses, our independents and our multinationals, have actually got different objectives, but at different points, survival, because of the fact that it's such a dynamic market, has been a really important part of their business. Now, in terms of growth, we've got different growth strategies, haven't we? If we think about growth, really we're thinking about organic growth, so growth through their own activities, new stores, new products, and inorganic growth through mergers and takeovers. So I kind of just had a look and try to find some basic examples of these. Again, obviously, if you see one of these, you'll see it in a case study, right? So look in the case studies. Are there examples of organic and inorganic growth? Could this be a potential question area? So we've got HMV's acquisition of 15 Zavvi stores following Zavvi going into administration in 2009, like another example of a business in this industry going into administration because they obviously struggled with the technological growth within the market. We've got the Universal Music Group. We're going to talk about them a little bit more later on, attempting to acquire the recorded music part of EMI in 2012, but that being blocked by regulators. We've got Spotify, who've made a ton of acquisitions. These three aren't necessarily examples of music industries. So Podsights, Chartable, and The Ringer, they're not music takeovers, but they're examples of a music-based business diversifying. So you think about like them getting into podcasts and getting later into audiobooks with the audiobook publishers Findaway. Examples of Spotify, like a big company, you think about Ansoff's Matrix, diversifying, trying to attract new users to their service, people who wanted to listen to audiobooks, or people who wanted to listen to podcasts who maybe weren't necessarily as interested in music. That's kind of an example of them trying to diversify their portfolio to try and attract these potential people. We've also got Sony Music. So Sony Music has been a massive acquirer in the music industry. They've bought businesses like The Orchard, Sony ATV, Ministry of Sound, EMI Music Publishing, and Alamo. So Sony Music's been kind of prominent in that. Again, obviously, if you get a question on this, you'll get a case study that tells you the examples. I'm just trying to give you examples of the kind of things worth looking for. And then EMI as well. So Sony Corporation, I mentioned this one previously, but it's worth mentioning again just because of the cost. £2.7 billion in 2018. So we see mergers and takeovers. We see growth in a bunch of different ways in this industry. In terms of global music recording and distribution, the key thing here is to understand different distribution channels. Let's start with that. So we've got our direct distribution from producer to customer. We've got our modern distribution, I'm going to get out of the way here, from producer to retailer to consumer. And then we've got that traditional distribution channel where producer, wholesaler, retailer, consumer. I don't think there's too much traditional here, but we have got examples of direct and modern, which are worth looking into. So direct distribution could be a company, a website such as Bandcamp or SoundCloud, where artists kind of just upload their own music and they can then distribute that directly to their customers. For modern distribution, most digital music goes through a DSP, a digital service provider like Spotify, Apple Music, Deezer, etc. I read an interesting article about music distribution, which I will put a link to in the description if you want to read into this in a little bit more depth. But just definitely worth bearing in mind kind of the benefits and the drawbacks of distribution. Obviously, the direct distribution is going to be a bit more difficult to get big, broad reach unless you're obviously a huge artist where you have a following who are paying attention to your latest move. Modern distribution, you get the benefit of using those retailers, right? Exposure on Spotify is massive. And not just exposure on Spotify, but if you can get yourself onto one of Spotify's kind of like home playlists, that can have a huge, huge impact. I don't know if you'll have noticed if you've got Spotify, but now it feels like what we're seeing more, and I don't think we saw this until about a year or two ago, when you log in, you'll see like a recommended album, like a new album recommended for you. I never saw that before, but it clearly is an example of publishers trying to kind of push their music to the front, much in the same way that in the olden days, you would walk into a CD shop and you'd see certain CDs in the window, or you'd see like certain tables near kind of key parts. Now they're doing it by doing it as like a pop-up ad. So these digital service providers are really, really important in the distribution channels. Now, in terms of the process that we go through to get music from start to finish, let's go through that process and the different stages that it does go through. Not necessarily all in terms of distribution, but the actual recording of music as well. So we've got music production, the writing, recording, and editing of music ready for distribution. We've then got the role of the producer as part of this. They oversee the production process. They bring together the different components of music production, whether that's putting together the different kind of like parts of music, so recordings, whether that's the editing and all of the different things. I'm not going to pretend to be some sort of expert on those things, but that's what a producer does. We've then got the recording element. So this is where a composed track is captured. And it's important to note here that different people can own a song, like the actual copyright of the song, and own the recording and the original recording of the song. We're going to talk about this in an example in a second. And then distribution. So all of the above is handled and managed by the record label. And then a distributor comes in, and it's their job to get the music to stores and to digital platforms. So the distributor is the kind of the key part that actually gets the music to you and me. Now, I mentioned about owning music, and I did a bunch of work researching this and writing this slide, and then there was a breaking news this week that in fact, I'm recording this on Sunday. I think this news came out on Friday. So Taylor Swift worked under the record label Big Machine Records when she began her career as a teenager. I think she started when she was like 15. I'm not a Swiftie by any stretch, but I've done my research because obviously she's a marketing kind of phenomenon, isn't she? So as a result, Big Machine Records owned the original recordings of her first 6 albums, the 6 that are kind of listed on the screen there. And they sold these recordings to a private equity firm in 2020 for about $300 million, which meant that the private equity firm could control where the music was kind of used, whether it was used in adverts and things like that. And for Taylor Swift, she couldn't control that unless she bought it back. So as a result, she went back, and I think she recorded 4 of those albums again as Taylor's version. So that's kind of where I was going to end that, just to kind of really emphasize the point that there's a difference in terms of who owns the song and who owns the recording and can distribute the recording of the song. And then, obviously all of our more recent stuff is recorded with different criteria. But then I saw this news article, which was that she's bought back her master recordings of her original albums. Now, so I just shared the statistic that it was bought for $300 million in 2020. There's not like a specific amount of money that's been disclosed for this Taylor Swift buying it back, but the estimates are that it's between 400 and 700 million, which does go to show how much money Taylor Swift made from music in general, that she can afford to do that. But there was loads of controversy around it. There was loads of controversies about how young she was when she signed the record deal and whether they took advantage of that and signed it in favourable conditions. There's lots of controversy about bullying involving kind of like Scooter Braun and Kanye West and things like that. But just in terms of like a music recording side of things, it's just a really good example of that. You don't necessarily own the recordings of your own music. It's dependent on the record label and the agreement you've got with them. So in terms of key record labels, we've got the big three really: Universal, Sony and Warner Music Group. Just to kind of give you an example of who is in these, I found a bit of a list. So Universal, Taylor Swift, Drake, Billie Eilish. I'm not going to read through the whole list, but you can get an idea of like how many prominent popular artists there are there. Sony has a bunch of superstars as well, and so does the Warner Music Group. So you can see that a lot of the biggest stars that you have heard of will be parts of one of these 3 record labels. There are obviously smaller ones. These are the big 3, known for obvious reasons, because they're the 3 biggest. So in terms of market share, in terms of kind of oligopolies, that's the kind of way that industry works. We can link that to a whole bunch of different areas. You can link that to kind of market structures. You can link that to things like Porter's 5 forces, for example, like bargaining power of record labels would be an interesting thing to have a look at, and who has the bargaining power. Is it that the artists have got a lot of power, or is it that the labels have got a lot of power because they've got a huge amount of sway in terms of distribution and things like that? So just some interesting examples there to just be aware of if you see them in a case study. Right, let's have a look at entrepreneurs then. So roles and qualities of entrepreneurs setting up music events. Now, I think of all of the bullet points, this is probably the easiest bit to identify on the specification. We've got 2 topics here. 1.5.1, the role of an entrepreneur. 1.5.2, entrepreneurial motives and characteristics. So let's go through what's on the spec, and then we can just link this to this industry. The role of the entrepreneur is literally about what the entrepreneur does, and there's 3 main roles within the specification. You've got those, and you've got the entrepreneurial motives, and it's really important to understand the difference between the 2. The role is what an entrepreneur does. The motive is what they want to get out of the business. We also have entrepreneurial qualities, which are the characteristics demonstrated by the entrepreneur. So it's really important that we know the difference between all of these. I'm going to put a list together just to give you a bit of an idea. The role of an entrepreneur Setting a business, like obviously the first thing to becoming an entrepreneur is to start a business. So creating and setting up a business is one. Running and growing up a business is the second role, and then third is just innovation as part of running and growing a business. So that's what an entrepreneur actually does. A motive is what they want to get out of it. So this could be profit. Obviously, they probably want to make some money. Profit maximization is trying to get as much as you possibly can. Profit satisfying is just trying to get enough to live a satisfactory quality of life. You've also got flexibility, control, independence. So non kind of financial motivators about wanting to kind of run your own, be in charge of your own destiny, run your own business, and etc. And then sometimes it's social objectives. Sometimes it is just because of like passion and things like that, like passion for music and wanting to be part of that kind of industry because it's the biggest kind of passion you've got. In terms of qualities, taking risks is a really important one. Creativity as well, of course, and leadership, organization, all of those kind of like general skills you would need to be a successful entrepreneur. So just worth making sure we're aware of those different, the difference between those three elements, because content-wise they're quite straightforward, but it is finding them in the case study. That's obviously the key thing there. I consider doing like a bit about key entrepreneurs, but to be honest, you're going to get a case study if there's a particular entrepreneur, and there's so many thousands, and it could just be, it talked about setting up music events, so it could be any kind of like local person who does that, and so I didn't want to give a bunch of examples that, if you're going to get an example, you'll get it in the case study. In terms of the risk element, when we talk about risk in setting up music events, it's usually the promoter who takes on this risk. So I wanted to do a little bit more of a deep dive on promoters. So I found this article. I'll get out the way there. I found this article online. This was something that Grant prompted me to have a look into. I'll put this into the description as well. But I thought it was quite interesting because it was talking about where the concert ticket money goes. We're going to talk about ticketing a little bit later on. Who's getting rich and who's got the risk? And I never actually understood how musicians got paid. Did they get a percentage of the ticket sales or whatever like that, anything like that? So this kind of shed some light, and Grant gave me a few bits of information as well. So typically it's the promoter that takes on more of the risk when they're setting up a live music event. Usually the performer will get a fixed fee, and potentially, depending on how influential they are, certainly bigger ones might get a percentage of ticket sales as well. The ticketing agency obviously take their cut from the ticket prices. The venue also get a fixed fee. So the independent promoters might book their chosen artists at venues, and then they just hope they can sell enough tickets to break even. In terms of big shows, they're probably going to be put on by big promotion companies, because you would need to have quite a lot of upfront capital to hire like the O2 and book Dua Lipa. You can't just do that if you're just like doing this by yourself. It's going to cost you thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds to do so. So I just thought it was quite interesting to think about the benefits of the risk level there and who actually takes the risk. So if a gig goes on and there's not many tickets sold, the artists are probably still going to get most of their money. They're still going to get their fixed fee. It's actually the promoter who's probably going to take the hit. I read an article recently about the Linkin Park reunion tour and how the first few gigs had really high levels of demand, and then after the first kind of 5, when they did their first big tour for their album, they had to go into smaller venues. The promoters had to put them into smaller venues because they just weren't selling enough tickets. But there's a few little key terms there that I thought were worth mentioning. Break even, like the promoter trying to break even on an event by selling enough tickets to kind of cover the costs, the fee they've given to the artist and the fee they're paying, the fixed fee they're paying for the venue. And then upfront capital, when we think about cash flow, we think about the importance of cash. For the promoter, they need the cash up front to hire the premises and pay the artist, and then they're hoping that they get the money back when the tickets go on sale. So I thought that was quite interesting there in terms of the role of the promoter. I've put these two together. These are the last two. Live music events in the UK and the businesses operating in these, and managing resources. So it's a few areas to this. I'm going to kind of do them together, these last 2 bullet points, because it's kind of all really about live music. And in some of the bits when I want to talk about businesses, I also want to talk about resources. So I've just kind of put these 2 bullet points together. So let's start with ticketing. So ticketing companies mostly are online, but there are obviously physical ticket stalls. I can't remember the last time I bought a ticket for anything in person. But they mostly sell their tickets directly through their platforms, and they do this in collaboration with artists, venues, and promoters. They profit through booking fees convenience fees, delivery fees, and these are added to the price of the ticket. So you might see a ticket for 50 quid, and then you might pay 65, and then 65 is usually where the ticketing companies get their money through booking fees and stuff like that. Now, there's a few different factors here that are worth kind of paying attention to. The first is supply and demand. There's a limited amount of supply based on the amount of seats or the amount of space and the capacity of a venue. Demand might far outstrip that. And so quite often you can find this rush of demand trying to get tickets. And what this can lead to, especially tickets of really prominent popular artists, having inelastic demand, because even though they're a luxury product, people know that the amount of demand far outstrips the amount of supply. So we've seen some examples here, like Oasis and the Arctic Monkeys taking advantage of this by using dynamic pricing. Dynamic pricing is something that's been really prominently in the news. Think about pricing strategies. This would be a great question to get. Dynamic pricing is where basically, if a product is in demand, they can increase the price of it effectively. So people went on the Oasis ticket. One of my students said he paid something like 370 quid for a ticket for Oasis. And the ticket prices just boomed up from like 120 quid to over 300 quid. And you're getting the exact same kind of entrance. It's just depending on when you are in the queue is where you buy it. So it's similar to what they do for like hotels or airlines, where for example, if you want to go on holiday during the school holidays, you'll probably find it's more expensive to get a hotel because there's more demand because people haven't got children in school and things like that. Same goes for flights, same goes for train tickets and all sorts of different things like that. There's also a little bit of technology in terms of bots as well. So bots and kind of technology and AI and things like that. Bots have been used to buy tickets and then have them available for being resold on higher prices. That's provided a lot of controversy as well. So you think about like bots and scalpers and, basically people just trying to buy 10, 15 tickets to something that they know has got high demand so they can just sell them on and make a profit. Really, really annoying. I mentioned Glastonbury as an example. I'm going to touch on Glastonbury very briefly in a minute when we talk about festivals. My brother's been to Glastonbury twice. I've never obviously gone because it's like a 4-day thing and it's on a weekend during school time. So the chances of me ever going to Glastonbury are pretty slim unless I was to go for a day. But to be completely honest, even if I wanted to go, I would love to go actually. I do want to go, but it's obviously not conducive to my career. The chance of me getting a ticket would be really slim. Every year, there's like 3 different windows of ticket sales. And every year, he sends me a list of his friends with their kind of like postcodes and all their information you need to buy tickets. And he says, can you help me out? And there'll be like 15 of us trying to get him and his pals tickets for Glastonbury. And the success rate is so low. So, there's a lot of problems with tickets. But it all links again to this stuff about supply and demand. I think there's a few topics you could think about here. Thinking about legislation. In particular, like the pricing and strategies and whether that's legal, especially because it's not always disclosed very well beforehand. Use of technology. Again, technology we've mentioned in an earlier part of this. Pricing strategies, price elasticity, distribution for tickets and things like that. There's a bunch of things that could come up in terms of this. So well worth being a little bit aware of kind of how it all works. In terms of music venues, many music venues are multi-purpose, especially the big ones. Others, in particular, more local venues are music specific, but they've all got a few different things that they've got to consider, right? Staffing and human resources. What kind of staff are they going to have? And how do they kind of manage the staff they've got? So I'm thinking things like temporary staff, part-time staff, flexible working hours. Most of the music gigs are in the evenings for obvious reasons. So you're going to have flexible working hours. It might not be that there's a gig every Friday or Saturday. You've also got contractors like specialists. So that could be like people involved in the music side of things. There's always in a gig that little kind of like tent with all the computers and all the... I'm not going to try and use technological language there for music because I don't have a clue about any of that stuff. But you've got those people there who are obviously really clever and obviously doing like the mixing to make sure the volumes are all correct and stuff like that. So there might be potential contractors. You might get security teams and catering teams coming in contracted. Some venues might do it themselves. You think about like things like festivals in particular, they'll have a whole bunch of different businesses who will pay to go onto site and all sorts. So in terms of staffing and human resources, I just think that's quite an interesting thing to think about. Like, how do you manage your human resources? In terms of physical resources, we've obviously got costs and then the impact that has on profitability. So like small venues, for example, they'll struggle to cover their high fixed costs. And there's been a lot of campaigns to try and support local music venues over the last few years, because a lot of smaller music venues have closed because, quite frankly, their costs are really, really high and they're not getting enough people, especially since COVID, into local music venues. So I think that's just worth mentioning, capacity utilization, the massive importance of capacity utilization. If you have, if you've got 800 spaces, the more of those tickets you can sell, the more you're spreading your fixed costs over more consumers, the more you're kind of benefiting from economies of scale, and the more you're benefiting from increased capacity utilization. We talk about the downsides to high levels of capacity utilization for gigs. Let's be honest, every gig wants to sell out. They want 100% capacity utilization, don't they? So it's a little bit of a different kind of example there, because every person that comes in, providing that it's safe, obviously, that's why the capacities are set as what they are. They want 100%. Anything less than that is a missed opportunity. In terms of festivals tie in a lot of what we've discussed already. Glastonbury, Leeds and Reading. My first ever gig was Radio 1 Big Weekend in Sunderland. We think about ticketing, by the way. It wasn't a case of just going on the website and getting a ticket. I was 16 when Radio 1 Big Weekend, I think it was 2005, it came to Sunderland. I'm obviously not from Sunderland, I'm from Newcastle, but it was close to home. And to get the ticket for the first day, you had to basically be there in a queue, in a car park in Sunderland. So me and my friends must have been probably just around when we were doing our GCSEs, on a Friday night, got dropped off in this car park in Sunderland, and we basically just like slept on the floor in a car park overnight, and then about 7 o'clock in the morning got tickets to go to the gig. And it felt great when it came around because it was earned. We obviously didn't queue for the second night because we were 16, we couldn't do 2 nights like that in a car park. I'm surprised my mum let me do it, but different times back then. Now you just kind of go on a website and buy it. But I thought it was the only proper big festival I've gone to. But it was great. I saw Foo Fighters and Kasabian. It was a great day. So we think about all of these different things that we've discussed. So staffing, temporary workers, volunteers. Obviously, these festivals are once a year. Glastonbury's going to have core staff that work all the way through the year and over the years. And sometimes, obviously, they take a year off to kind of let the land kind of settle. So they'll be relying quite heavily on temporary workers who are only going to be working for the maybe week leading up to it, or maybe just the festival themselves and maybe the cleanup operations. In terms of physical resources, a lot of the times these things are all put up and taken down in a really short window, which is obviously quite expensive and difficult to organise. That could be the case for any kind of gig at a football stadium, where it's not a music arena. They don't have those things set up. You see the massive amounts of work that it takes to put these things into place, and thinking about then that means that the gig or the festival has to make a lot of revenue to cover all of these massive costs. And ticketing, we talked about like ticketing Glastonbury. I don't know what the capacity of Glastonbury is, but the tickets are nearly impossible to get. It seems wild to think it obviously sells out in minutes every single year. So these are massive operations, and so it wouldn't surprise me to see an example of like a festival as one of the case studies. So it's just worth thinking about some of the things I've mentioned here. I've also just put a little note in here. Every year I teach decision trees, critical path analysis and investment appraisal, and spend quite a lot of time doing so. And I always kind of just think, all right, cool, what are we going to get from this? Like, are we going to get a good question on it? And it just keeps disappointing me by not coming up. But maybe this could be it, like arranging a festival could be an opportunity for some of these calculation questions, decision trees, critical path analysis, investment appraisal. So keep an eye out for those. That would be good if we got one of those. The last kind of thing I want to say really, the last example is just to kind of link to ethics really. When you're talking about managing resources, there's obviously a massive environmental impact of a gig, not just because of all of the touring across the world and the carbon footprint that occurs, but also just the logistics of actually setting it all up and all of that. And so I wanted to use an example of Coldplay, because Coldplay for the last few years have been going to the most significant kind of lengths to try and reduce their emissions and reduce their environmental impact. So I've seen Coldplay a few times. I'm going again in August actually to Wembley, and they always put a really cool kind of like show on. There's always a lot of parts to it. But they've done a bunch of interesting things over the last few years. So they've got a kinetic dance floor section that they bring to the arenas and they set up, and kind of concert goers, fans can go on there, and as they're jumping around the dance floor, and bikes, like you can watch the gigs on these little kind of exercise bikes. It generates electricity to kind of power some of the gig and some of the equipment that's being used. They've reduced their emissions by about 59%. They've been doing loads of diverting of waste through reusing and recycling. And they've also invested a lot of carbon offsets to try and counteract the negative carbon footprint that they've had by planting trees for each ticket sold and for paying for sustainable aviation fuel. So when they're flying, they're trying to fly in. Look, you can't get to like Costa Rica and Chile and all these different countries that they're playing in, because they're all over the world, India, etc., without flying. And so they are going to have a negative impact on the environment. But it's interesting to just see an example of a business that's trying to do something about that. So I thought it was worth looking at as an example. That's everything I've kind of got for this industry. As I said, obviously, at the beginning, you don't need to have done some research, but hopefully some of this stuff helps. Maybe some of the topics come up. That would be great. It's always nice when that happens because we feel like we've got a little bit of a head start. Maybe some of the context we talked about will come up, but use the case study. Obviously, that's the most important thing. Make sure you get your timing right. Focus on all those kind of things I mentioned at the beginning. And I wish you the best of luck. Obviously, if you're watching this video, you're in year 13. And so you're not going to be using this channel next year. So yeah, thanks for all of the kind words and weird comments, and watching the channel and all of those things. I wish you all the very best of luck with whatever comes next. Let me know how you get on in the exams, and I'll see you soon.